So welcome everyone to the multi-species coronavirus reading group. Lisa and Giovanni, you've offered us a delightful selection of papers today. We have more authors in the room perhaps than any event that we've done before. Also, William and Suze are here from Toronto. And maybe I'll just open it up. You know, as historians, you were writing about a historical moment. In the framing essay, Lisa and Giovanni, you talk about the 30 papers that you curated in this collection that reflected the state of the world in late 2020. You talked about, you know, what has been happening and what is going to happen to our lives, to the planet, socioeconomic relations, the interpretations of the meaning of life, as well as more abstract things like the nature of viruses, the history of RNA research, human-animal relations, things like structural inequality, mental health, also freedom, identity, uncertainty, skepticism. And, you know, here we are about a year later, and in some ways that's a moment in the past. In some ways it's a moment we're still living. So just broadly, I'd like to invite the two of you to reflect on, you know, how the essays that you collected together last year speak to the ongoingness of this situation.
Yeah, that is during the pandemic, we had a meeting of the editorial board of History and Philosophy of Life Sciences. And at a certain point, we decided to do something in order to create a sort of an open space for the discussion. And so we thought about two kinds of different topical collection. One with very short notes in order to fix, from a certain point of view, the situation in a very quick time. And the other constructed with longer papers, so on and so forth. So Lisa and I had the mandate to edit this topical collection. And actually, it was a really surprise because we received really a lot of contribution from different parts of the world, from the East, from the East, from the North, from the South, and with a lot of different approaches. Ethnographic approaches, anthropological approaches, ethical approaches, political approaches. But what was particularly interesting is that from a certain point of view, we received contribution from different traditions of thought. That is, there was people coming with a very strict continental approach, with a very analytical approach, but also paper reflecting the way in which in certain country philosophy is done. And so it could be interesting also from a sociology of science or sociology of knowledge to read all these 47 papers, 47 notes, in order to create a sort of analysis of the different ways in which philosophy or something related to philosophy could be done. And at the end, we were extremely surprised, but extremely happy of this incredible variety of different perspective and point of view. Lisa, do you want to add something?
Sure. First, thank you so much, Evan and Rachel, for organizing all of us together, because it's fascinating having been on the editorial side to actually, during this pandemic situation, to meet our authors, because it's different from a conventional you know, a special issue of a journal where you might have a workshop first and then you might have a chance for all of the authors to get to know each other and so on. But this topical collection format allowed us to have a very broad or open perspective toward how we got to know our authors and got to have the opportunity and the privilege to work with them. Giovanni mentioned that we have 47 notes and they're really short. And one of the things that short format has enabled us to do, which we wanted, was to make sure that we could reach new authors and get to hear the voices from around the world. So not just the scholarly traditions that Giovanni mentioned, but get going with transhemispheric conversations, we need to understand each other. And so the authors that are represented in this topical collection come from many different places in the world. And I would say that the United States we would expect to see an avalanche of voices from the US, but actually it was just like 10 papers out of 47. And then of course, Italy, where there was so much suffering at the very beginning stages, we had quite a few authors from there, but also I'll just share so you have a sense of where these voices are all coming from. China, Japan, Kenya, South Korea, Australia, Greece, Colombia, Portugal, Romania, Pakistan, Poland, Denmark, South Africa, Ireland, Bangladesh, Turkey. So these are just the flavor of the different perspectives that are out there. And they together are complicating this, our ideas of what are the narratives, what are the universal forms of knowledge that exist with respect to nations in particular, because all of these perspectives can, when we received them, we didn't know exactly where the voices were coming from. And so it was kind of interesting to see how bringing in an array of voices from different places maps onto the traditions, if they are scientists or social scientists, or from history, or from anthropology, or philosophy. And I think it's also quite notable that this special issue or topical collection comes out at the time it did. When we were formulating it, this was at the height of all of the global protests to bring attention to Black Lives Matter. And this produced a sense of a reflection for us. What should we do, and what is the most responsible thing that we could do to address issues like global inequalities that are not just acute, but that have been chronic. And that's something that it seems important for us to bring out, and I think dovetails with some of the conversations you've had along in your reading group, to encourage authors to reflect on their positionalities more deeply. And that's something that one of our very first papers that was accepted, that's the paper represented today by Suze Berkhout, brings that right into the middle, so that straight away we were able to have this reference point and encourage papers to the authors to depart from the easy chair, armchair philosophizing, and get into the concrete heart of matters when lives are specifically at stake, and not just human lives, of course. And so yeah, we're really excited to be here and to make connections. And we see that some of your other presenters in the past, Roberta, Rafayette, and Soraya Chadaravian, also have a paper in this topical collection called COVID-19 and Rethinking the Nature of Viruses. So yeah, this is a forum where we can break down some of those typical narratives that are about one country, one sort of location, one point of origin, one animal that causes the pandemic. So that's kind of how it has evolved. And as time has passed, I think Giovanni mentioned this also, but just to make it clear that because of the nature of our topical collection, it was open, and that all of the papers got published online as they got accepted, and then copy edited. That meant that we could see a change in the kind of topics and the kind of issues that unfurled, and where they geographically unfurled at the same time. If we were to continue to do this, I'm sure that the topics would also be changing. So.
Yes, may I add something else? That is, first of all, I would like to thank Rachel and Abel, but also our author, that is Bill, Suze, Carlos, and Sarai. We played in many times the role of mentor because some notes went through 3, 4, 5 revision. So from a certain point of view, we were not only the editor, but a sort of guide in order to help scholars from different parts of the world, more or less to have a similar approach, that is a problem, and the solution and argumentation. And this was really a nice thing, because there was a strict connection between the editor, the reviewers, and the authors. And we had the policy not to have a bad approach with a paper whose content was different from the usual, from the standard, but to help the authors to reach the standard required by history and philosophy of life science, in order to allow them to have an international scenario. And this was pretty appreciated by many authors. That's it.
So thanks to you both. If anyone else wants to jump in, feel free to either type questions in the chat, unmute yourself, or raise your hand, and I can call on you. Building on those comments, I wanted to jump right into Suze's essay. So you talk about how COVID is not a great equalizer and how it amplifies existing health inequities. You adopt a intersectional approach along with your co-author Lisa Richardson, and I was wondering if you could just draw us into some of the intersectional dimensions that you observed at that point in the pandemic, and also reflect on the dynamics that you see going on now.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. So it's interesting. So Lisa and I work together at Toronto General Hospital. We work in different departments, but we had run into each other in like the coffee lineup one morning, and that was sort of how the piece sort of came to be. We were sort of, we had hardly kind of recognized each other, because we had sort of, I'm a psychiatrist. I don't normally wear scrubs. I don't normally wear a scrub cap, but everyone at that point in the pandemic, when we were working on this, I think people had not a lot of idea about exactly what we needed to do to sort of stay well and safe in the hospital setting. And so sort of behind masks and visors and scrub caps and stuff, we could have like realized that it was a colleague in the coffee lineup. And so we had been sort of talking about like how is everyone doing? How are you doing? And we quickly got into this conversation about how so much of what we were seeing as the real challenges and struggles were things that were already pre-existing, and they were just exploding. So the pandemic was just amplifying the inequities, the injustices, and the challenges. And so, whether that was sort of from my perspective, from mental health standpoint, from like who were the most vulnerable people that I see in the healthcare system, they are the people often who are in some kind of carceral situation, or the continuum of that kind of carcerality. And then, which I recognize through the mental health system is also a part of that continuum. And so people who are in a lot of congregate sort of settings, that kind of thing, precariously housed, all of their resources that keep them sort of well in some kind of way were just sort of blown apart. And I think likewise, Lisa does a lot of work with Indigenous communities, both urban Indigenous communities, as well as on reserve. And she was seeing a lot of the same kinds of things. And sort of similarly, we were really struck from sort of the standpoint of, again, sort of those people who are already vulnerable. So, the things like trying to get access to shelters if you're in situations of interpersonal violence, that kind of thing. It's all sort of falling apart. And so we were, kind of reflecting on that. And that was really how we came to be be thinking about this, because there was this idea that this pandemic was the great equalizer, that it didn't discriminate between sort of who, in terms of who is going to be infected. You could be well off and in your 60s and still have a lot of risk because, by virtue of your age or that kind of thing. And it just, it really, that it became so apparent that wasn't what was going on, that there were many people who were able to work from home, who weren't in the same kinds of situations of precarity. And so we really wanted to bring something together to be able to talk about that. And at the same time, there had been this discussion going on that I was sort of following in different fields from, I think, within a lot of feminist thought, about how this was also going to roll back all kinds of advances that women had made and this is actually something that the WHO had also talked about as being, kind of quite concerned about what this meant with the sort of, all of the social restrictions that were going on, that so often, caregiving, whether it's for elderly parents or for children, kind of fall as a gendered role, and so sort of bringing all of these things together, that was sort of where we wanted to think from, and I think the other thing about our sort of approach to intersectionality, and it's always hard to write these like a short piece, and yet at the same time it was such a wonderful prompt that Lisa and Giovanni had put out, which was that question, like what ask and answer a question about COVID. And so I think that was such a wonderful prompt to be able to jump into thinking about why is COVID, why has it been called a disaster for feminism? And so because a lot of these conversations, people are struggling in all these different ways, and yet here Lisa and I were also kind of seeing that again, the people who had the most precarity had really sort of the greatest kinds of challenges, that this was just even more yet another way in which people were struggling, and so that I think that was really important for us to be able to bring forward and think about, and that prompt was one that was such a great one to be able to sort of say, yes, these are important conversations that people are having about what's happening with with say work, and are women, for example, women who are academics, going to like slide back because of things like the expectations for tenure when they've now had like a whole year, for example, of being sort of unable to carry out the kinds of things that they might otherwise have done, and yet that was and without sort of diminishing the challenge of that kind of perspective, we also felt like we needed to take on this bigger way of trying to sort of understand what was going on with how all of these different aspects of precarity kind of come together. That's a really long-winded answer to your question, but I think the thing that I've been thinking about now, just to sort of bring it kind of forward a bit, is also, when I think about intersectionality, I think also a lot about and I think this is one thing that didn't come out in the piece, and I think because of with the way that we had kind of approached the prompt, you can only kind of include so much. But the way I also think about it is to think about how you also have to include or think about or understand histories within intersectionality. So intersectionality is not just and I mean that ties to sort of social and group identities, but that issue of history, I think, is also one, and the issues that sort of how you bring forward things like conditions of possibility, that why is it that different groups have ended up in certain kinds of situations. And so some other work that I've been doing and kind of thinking with some other people on with respect to the pandemic had to do with things like vaccines, like vaccine clinical trials, and the idea that there was sort of an idea at some point that what we really needed to do was diversify clinical trials to make sure that there was sort of equity, and again sort of taking this sort of intersectional but also historically sort of sensitive kind of lens to that, means thinking a little bit differently about what does equity mean, and does it just mean sort of diversifying the you know, the social identities of people who are showing up into your clinical trial, or does it actually mean sort of trying to address all of this much more systematic issue, like systemic issues that lead to clinical trials being often carried out in certain kinds of ways? So that's the sort of way that I guess some of the work that I've been doing is kind of carried forward a bit.
I think that's a nice lead into Bill's paper, where he's talking about syndemics, synergistic epidemics, where the concern is with public health, community health, and the effects of social conditions on health, but also, you know, sort of staging this disagreement between Richard Horton, the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, who is saying pandemic is not, or sorry, the COVID-19 moment is not a pandemic, it's a syndemic. So then Emily Mendenhall, one of the medical anthropologists who defined syndemics in 2017, characterized that as misguided, you know, noting that in the US, you know, there is a syndemic, or was a syndemic, with hypertension, diabetes, respiratory disorders, systemic racism, sort of contributing to the uneven outcomes, but also pointing to how national context matters. So Bill, I was wondering if you wanted to jump in on those points.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would preface it to say that, you know, for Lisa and Giovanni, I thought this was a brilliant way to set up a problematic around COVID, which, I mean, I'm trained as a sociologist. I do a lot of work in history of medicine because I look at adoption or technological adoption in medicine. But never before have we had this opportunity to really work on a problem that was not well formed. And for me, this was a time when the archives I was working in were shut down, the libraries were shut down, and but I'd been teaching a lot of the ideas that I bring into the paper to students. And I work at an art and design college. I'm down the street from Suze. And I do courses on sociological perspectives of the future. I do courses on health and society, health and design, and so forth. And we were discussing these ideas, and this was just a wonderful opportunity to start to now apply this, to try to get something concrete going with some ideas that were largely abstract, which take a long time to develop with the students. Nevertheless, I was quite pleased to develop this short paper, and I was reading it over again last night because, well, lo and behold, it's a year old, which is not a very long time ago, but it seems like a very long time ago. But I've continued to work with these ideas because the libraries, the archives aren't open again yet. And I'm actually getting quite a lot of response at conferences and putting it out there to editors and so forth. But in relation to what Suze and Lisa were writing in their paper, I don't disagree with what they're saying. I mean, this is very right. But what I do is broaden the scope of the inquiry and the discussion. And I would say a key point of difference between the two papers is that on the one hand, you know, Suze was just describing how things exploded. There was all these movements that were exploding and coming around COVID. And it's the coming around COVID that I see as a convergence. A huge convergence. And of course, most recently, we've seen this with respect to climate change and COP26. We see people converging on this and bringing in all these other interests, which in the 1980s were very disparate interests. We used to talk about the new social movements in the 1980s, but these were all very separate interests. And it was easy to talk about stakeholders at that time because the people were very marginalized in terms of what they were taking up by way of, at the time, the women's movement, the ecological movement, the peace movement. I mean, these were all very disparate points that people would get involved with kind of on the sideline. And at the same time, it was challenging the traditional socioeconomic focus on class and political polarity. Certainly in the 21st century, certainly when I talk to my students who are all, you know, Gen Y and Gen Z now, they're not interested in the political spectrum at all. They don't want to get involved with that at all. They're interested in very particular issues, whether it be race or gender or indigenous issues, but at the same time, they want to lump them together, and they see themselves as being part of a larger concern. And certainly with the ecological issue that's come up now, they're all driven towards that. But interestingly enough, when I say to them, so tell me what the world's going to look like in 2050, I will often get a response like, well, ask us about something we can do something about. You know, and it comes back to this whole issue of, you know, apply the blame to whoever is responsible, make people accountable, get them to fix it. Whereas working in an art and design college, I'm saying to them, but hold on, you're training to be the ones that are going to fix this. So there's a big question that I bring to them in terms of, you know, what are you going to retain from the past by way of old normals? And what are you going to take forward into the future? And secondly, what new normals are required? So syndemics is very helpful. And I'm using syndemics in a very broad way here. This is moving away from the epidemiological base for this. And where you're right, where I brought in Horton and Emily Mendenhall, that discussion I thought was very nicely opened up the framework that, you know, we're still seeing now around. There's all sorts of these tensions that are moving together, but they are also contributors. And what I try to do with my students is get them to think in terms of disease, contagion. That's one aspect of this. It has an effect, but what's the larger social effect? So we don't see everything as being a contributor to disease and contagion, rather than the effect of contagion and disease is just part of this. So this is what I mean in terms of trying to open up that discussion. So maybe I'll leave it at that point.
Thanks. And again, if other folks have questions, comments, including here, Giovanni and Lisa and Rachel, you know, please jump in. I've got some more, but if anyone else wants to jump in, go for it. Okay, let's see, Rachel and Joanna, who wants to go first? I think they came in at the same time. Oh wait, sorry,
Joanna,
Rachel just wrote me a private note. Joanna, go ahead.
I have a question about curating the issue, because I thought the format was so interesting. A series of what read almost like provocations as well as analyses, and that kind of, as you put it in the introduction, that reveals some of the complexity by the sheer amount of different angles and different perspectives on it. And I was just really taken with the format of a special issue done in this way. And I just wondered if you had any particular, any reflections on particular challenges of organizing a special issue like this, like in terms of thinking about coherence. Was that something that was sort of discussed, or was an issue, or what you've spoken already a little about this, but I wondered if there were any particular challenges compared to a more conventional special issue.
I could say a few things and then pass it over to Giovanni. Joanna, thank you for that question. There are a couple of things that I would make note of. One is the the challenge of the form, which is short form, and to write for not just a general audience like a article for the Medium or something like this, but for specialists that would cross over between history and philosophy as the first part, because that's the journal name, but also then be legible, readable by university students, like Bill mentioned, but also policy people potentially, because we don't have that ability to control where it can go, but we can at least do something to prepare it to be legible and have the ability to quickly get to the point, whatever that important message is that the author is making. So that's one of the things. But about the form, the whole of the collection, the biggest question we had was about time. And in another context, I work on a disaster project based on the Fukushima triple disasters. And it's a very similar issue, which is, when does the disaster finish? And we had a time frame in which we had allowed authors to submit papers between like this window and this window of time. And that is, in a way, for us to manage the work. And I would say, and maybe Giovanni also has this impression, we were not expecting to have the volume of interest in that acute short amount of time. And so that leaves the question, is it responsible to finish it, to just put a bookmark here? Should we open it again in the future? Is this something that would be of service? Because a disaster in that context, where life sciences is part of this disaster in a very particular way, it's not finished. So how do we do that? And that's a kind of conversation I think we've had numerous times. And at the end of the day, there's a practical aspect to it too, which is from the publisher's perspective as well. And also, what counts as open access? The papers are open access to the extent that the pandemic is ongoing. So that's from a publisher business perspective, something that factors into the structures in which we work.
Yes, there was another nice aspect to face. That is, this kind of pandemic has been different treated in different countries. This means, coming to what Bill said about norms, that in different countries there are different norms. Different norms which are seen from a different tradition point of view. This has complexified the situation, also in reviewing the paper, because we have tried to suggest to the authors to make a sort of universal statement about your local situation, in order to compare, so to say, what is happening in that particular country in comparison with what is happening around the world. And this was a challenge, especially in deciding which paper has to be accepted and which paper has to be rejected, and which paper has a potential to be developed. And there was another aspect, that is, we had a senior author and junior author, and of course, the different a senior author write notes in a totally different way as a junior author, and so we have tried to make a sort of balance between the seniority and this was another point of view. And coming to what Suze said, there was not a disaster concerning feminism, but there was a disaster concerning older people. There was a disaster concerning fragile people. And so we tried to put together all this variety. And it was not only a burden, but it was an enrichment for us, because we had a clear idea of what was happening, not from a social point of view, not from a political point of view, but from the intellectual point of view. It is people from different parts of the world with totally different situation, pandemic situation. They are trying to conceptualize what was happening in their countries. And this was nice.
So we have some conversations stacking up in the chat between Francisco and Bill about the syndemic term. Also, Suze is talking about Lauren Berlant's work on the crisis ordinariness, and Soraya's got a hand up. Francisco and Bill, do you want to keep talking about the syndemic, or do you want to move the conversation elsewhere? Francisco.
Well, yeah. Just very briefly, what we are putting in the chat now, I think, is interestingly related to which fields of expertise or which areas of research contribute to what historians and philosophers of biology or of science in general are doing regarding epidemics or syndemics. So that's the only thing that I would say. And if there is a chance, I'd like to say something else later after Soraya or William.
Okay, Bill, do you want to respond?
Yeah, could I just switch screens for a minute?
Sure.
Host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay.
Let's see, I can make you a co-host, I think, or Rachel can. I don't think I can do it. Yeah.
It's done.
Oh, okay. Well, I can just explain. What I was going to show was an illustration that I find just brilliant with working with my students when they have concerns about this, to say, well, you know, this is all this discussion, but it really comes down to an epidemiological problem, right? And I'm saying no. And it's an illustration of a person holding up a placard at a Black Lives Matter protest, and it says, racism is a pandemic. And then it has a little illustration on it, hand painted, of a coronavirus. And you look at that and you think, off the one hand, okay, if we're using formal categories, sure. It's all focused on the effect of disease and contagion. And, you know, when we have discussions that say things like, racialized communities are more affected by COVID than others, you have to come back to that point of, well, you know, the virus doesn't discriminate. On the other hand, you get into a situation where, you know, as Mendenhall, this is why I use Mendenhall as an example. She's saying, look, you have to contextualize all this and look what's going on in racialized communities, and you have to start to branch out and look at the poverty levels. You know, I talk about hotspots and how in Ontario, all of a sudden we moved from an emphasis on vaccination for, according to particular age groups, to hotspots. And the hotspots were places that didn't have access to pharmacies and so forth. It's a brilliant example of looking at how you can expand upon and work with a framework that gets taken up into the mainstream. And Francesca's right, absolutely right. But it got taken up into the mainstream and then recovering it so that you can use it for a broader analysis of what's going on with the disaster.
Thanks, Bill. Soraya, go ahead.
I was still commenting on the editorial part of things, so we don't need to go there but I mean, the question was, it was interesting for me to hear a bit more about what was going on in the background. you know, and then you said they are published as they come up as a pointer in time, right, of how things looked at that moment. And that's quite an interesting idea, because, you know, I was really looking forward to seeing the whole collection sort of edited, right? And that in a way never happened, right? I mean, I saw when I then was in the Max Planck this summer, because they still have the print version, you know, and it's just exactly that, right? The paper as they came in. And so I personally felt frustrated, but how do you, because, you know, you don't get a grip very quickly, right? Which might be interesting for you or not, or I don't know. So there was a part of what we normally see as editorial work, right? Grouping things, making maybe an introduction that introduces the groups and so on, was not there. So how and I know that publishing now works like this, and I personally find it very frustrating when I edit something, right? Because we put all this work in, blah, 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 and then the papers just appear in the order as they're done, right? And so how frustrating did you find that? Or yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts about that. As an editor, I think this is really, it makes it really very difficult, I think. Anyway.
No, Soraya, actually, it was not frustrating on my part. It was something exciting, really exciting, because we worked together with Lisa and me with great harmony, without any problem. We received a lot of paper, and we worked together. That is actually, I was really enthusiastic to read notes from different parts of the world, notes from different perspectives. With this kind of publishing, that is a continuous publishing, there was a sort of timely production of the notes. That is, whenever the notes were accepted, they were immediately published, and the review process was extremely fast. So actually, it was something strange. It was something strange in comparison with the standard way of editing a collection of paper in a journal or in a book. It was really different. Also because when you receive a note of a couple of pages, you are able to read it in an hour, 2 hours, and so send immediately out for review. And we had this kind of policy. That is, we received the paper, and according to the policy that we have in history, philosophy of science, we have only 1 reviewer for the notes and 2 or 3 reviewers for the longer, for the usual manuscript. In this case, if we are able to produce a plausible review of the paper we have just received, we go without an external reviewer. Instead, if we weren't able to produce something plausible, we send it out. And in this way, the process was extremely fast, extremely. What do you think, Lisa? Have you?
Yeah, I just want to empathize with Soraya. I do understand that frustration. And I want to just, put that into a perspective, because I want to go back to this question of what is the responsibility of this journal, given the enormous privilege that it has to have all of the apparatus of this major publishing company, and how can we leverage that so that it's useful for our authors and their intended audiences. So the purpose of what these papers are for, I think, is very different from what, say, a more boutique journal special issue might be for. That might be for building a career. And then these short form essays might also be for building a career, but they also have a certain kind of expectation of having a life beyond the publication itself. We all know that there are many journal articles that are published are never cited, and I have to share that the citation rates for the articles in the topical collection are above average of the general HPLS journal citation rates, and their download rates are much higher as well. And so being in a topical collection attracts certain kinds of readers and audiences that would be paying attention more to how things are being circulated in more informal venues, not the journal itself. So social media really matters. Twitter is important. Your own academic networks and the circles that you maintain as an author, you have a lot of say in how that scholarship reaches other people. So it can appear to be a little bit different from a typical edited journal issue, again, like a neat bound volume. These essays, these 47 essays came out in 2 volumes of HPLS. Each is about that thick. And I was shocked because when I saw this in physical form, because usually HPLS journals are not so, extravagant, but the form of this topical collection allowed us to really push the envelope of what that volume is that can be published, while also trying to maintain that quality. We worked very closely with every single author, and Giovanni has mentioned this, but the pleasure of working with authors who we don't normally get to publish with, but who are new to HPLS and are from countries we've never worked with before. That was just extremely humbling.
Yeah, can I just add, I think it was because it was COVID related that it was picked up in some kind of a sharing kind of thing, because I also found that this article, my little piece, I think it was because it was COVID, and so it fell under this thing that COVID literature needed to be shared quickly and globally. I think it was picked up somehow from that point of view, because I think I even received, yeah, that's what was my feeling. I don't think another topical collection would necessarily also be picked up in that way, right? I think it fell under this sort of quick sharing of COVID related thing. And now I get review requests from the strangest journal that think I'm a COVID specialist in COVID something here, COVID something there. So I think it came into this whirlwind of.
Actually, Soraya, you said right. That is, I think that with this topical collection in History, Philosophy of Science, more or less, I think, as far as I know, the only journal, so to say, in the humanistic part of the knowledge that dedicate a topical collection to COVID structured in this way, As you know, instead in the medical field, there are a lot of paper on COVID. There were enormous number of papers on COVID. But I think that you're pretty right. That is, the topic was the right topic, and we had the luck, the fortune to think about this kind of topical collection. And this was pretty, I think, peculiar in our field.
So Suze, you had your hand up earlier, and you also have a comment on the chat about Berlant. Do you want to jump back in?
Sure, yeah, and I might actually be able to link them together. My hand up was actually because when Lisa was speaking just now, I had this thought. I was like, oh, one of the things that we ended up doing, Lisa and I ended up doing in our contribution to the special issue, which Lisa probably does this more than I do. I mean, the kind of writing that I often do doesn't usually come up with all kinds of suggestions for how to make changes. I tend to write, pieces that are a lot, it's a critical rethink of an issue or something like that. And so, but in this, with the prompt that Lisa and Giovanni provided, I think Lisa and I were really, Richardson and I were in some ways kind of felt compelled to say, okay, what are you going to do with this? There's a sort of like, and I think that speaks to what Lisa and Giovanni were sort of saying about like, there needs, like, how do we make something and do something and make some kind of movement with what it is that we're doing. And so in our case, in the piece that Lisa Richardson and I did, we sort of had said, well, what would an intersectional response to what could one part of an intersectional response look like? And in Canada, anyways, I think there's not really particularly adequate ways that data is disaggregated, but there's ways that we need to think about if you're disaggregating data to be able to understand larger sort of like patterns, that there's a whole data governance issue that really needs to be thought about carefully. And, people much smarter than me are doing that thinking. And so it's sort of we can sort of use this platform that we're being given in this really short piece to sort of say, look, there's something that's actually concrete that can come from it. And so I was thinking about that as Lisa today was just saying how how they were sort of like, how do we use this platform that we have as the editors of a special issue to sort of make some kind of movement. And in some ways that process was kind of replicated in the piece that we had contributed, and I think in a lot of the other pieces as well, that there was sort of this, there's sort of this parallel process of how are we doing things as within the whole, like as editors, how are they doing things within the whole collection to try to have something that is not just saying something, but trying to do something and intervene in the world in some way. And I think that a lot of the pieces were like that too. And I think it is because of the structuring of the prompts that they're able to do that in a digestible kind of way. This is a prompt that it's not a prompt to create a 10,000 word essay where you're going to analyze every single sort of subset of something, but you kind of really have to sort of move in to what's a critical kind of issue. And so, yeah, so there was a moment where I had looped that back to thinking about crisis ordinariness from Berkhout, but I think I've lost my thread. Oh, you know what it was? Actually, it's a question back to Giovanni and Lisa. So when I was thinking about, so I was, as people were talking, and I was like, oh, this, reminds me a little bit of crisis ordinariness and the sort of idea that, instead of shifting from like trauma as an event to the way in which this is like the traumas are social and they're lived collectively and they are part of this unfolding of the history of the present kind of moment. And that's sort of where kind of Berkhout is sort of goes with that. And then they are talking about how, affect and aesthetics are the ways into understanding what's happening in this sort of unfolding present moment. And so that I was thinking about that within this sort of discussion that Lisa was having of that sort of temporality. When does disaster sort of finish? And so what that maybe made me also think of was, what other ways would you see if you were going to do further work, like say another kind of issue, or open this sort of temporality back up again? What are there other kinds of methods or approaches or ways that you might want to see other authors bring something forward in the next sort of iteration? And so where that kind of question or kind of comes from for me is, do we need to attend to other kinds of things in the next sort of unfolding of what this sort of present moment is? There was a sort of way that the first prompt sort of structured the papers that kind of went forward. Would you do the same kind of thing, or would you do something different, or try to bring in other kinds of methods or approaches to sort of get to this next kind of unfolding? I think was the question that I had in my mind as I was listening.
Do you want to take that final question? We've got about 1 minute left, Giovanni and Lisa.
Yes, I was thinking about what Suze said, and Dumas wrote The Three Musketeers, and then he wrote another novel, which is 20 years after. So I think it would be interesting to ask to the 47 author to write a shorter note than the note 2 years after, because the great part of this paper has been written during the pandemic. But it would be interesting to know what is happening after the pandemic. That is, if the same author are of the same, have the same idea. And so, Lisa, we could think about this. That is, 2 years after, what is the same idea?
I was just writing
situation?
down as you were saying that it would not just be interesting to hear if the authors have some updates, but to invite other comments from other scholars whose perspectives would also be valuable to weigh in. So the idea of syndemics, like where have we gone since then? I think that would be really interesting to explore.
All right, thank you everybody for sharing these delightful papers. Oh, do you have a final parting thought, Bill? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, there we go. Just on that point, I mean, I'm rather amazed at how people are talking about, well, it's over, or it's almost over and we're about to recommence. I don't have that sense at all. I think this is going to be going on for a fair while yet, and I'm especially astonished to hear the people in Europe talking about this when, you know, you've got riots over there. What's going on in the Netherlands, what's going on in Belgium, what's going on in Vienna. This is not over yet. So I'm curious about the 2 years thing, but 2 years on, let's see where we are. I don't know if the disaster will be over. I think that's a very good question that Lisa's raised, of when does the disaster finish? We might still be asking that question. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I really like that parting thought, and I'm still sitting with the work that you were talking about, Lisa, in Japan, where you're living with these ongoing hauntings of radioactive afterlives. So yeah, I think yeah, the event is blurring, and yeah, life is ongoing. So thanks everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all, and yeah, thanks again for sharing these essays, and feel free to come back anytime.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
you all.